Okay, we'll start it again. It's as Tim knows, a great personal pleasure for me to welcome Tim Lockley to our webinar. Tim is professor of history at Warwick. He's the author of several books, most recently and relevantly for this evening, Military Medicine and the Making of Race. I'm also very pleased to say he's the associate editor of Slavery and Abolition, which means I speak to him more or less on a daily basis. His title this evening is The West India Regiments in the War of 1812, and we will proceed as usual. There'll be plenty of time for a Q&A, and I'm sure you're all familiar with the process of either asking a question in chat or in raising your hand. So I will pass it over to Tim.
Thank you, Gad. I'm hoping you can see my PowerPoint.
Yes.
Good. Oh, well, that's really helpful. That's just hidden it. Hidden my notes from me. Oh, how do I do that? Okay, I'm gonna have to do something a bit weird. I'm gonna have to look. You're gonna have to look at it like this, I'm afraid, because otherwise I can't see my notes. It might, my whole screen disappears. So yes, this is a talk about the West India Regiments in the War of 1812. For those of you who don't know, the West India Regiments are regiments created in the Caribbean from 1795 onwards, and they're made up of men of African descent. And they are enlisted into the British Army. And here is an example of what these regiments would have looked like. This is a man wearing the usual red coat of the British Army. This is a 5th West India Regiment soldier from 1814, so absolutely the time that we're talking about. One of the things that is worth sort of touching on today, I think, which is relevant to obviously to our contemporary history, is that we recently had a headline about the erasure of non-white soldiers from history, and the erasure of the West India Regiments from the War of 1812 is an absolutely classic example of that. So what I wanted to do when I set out was to try and establish, what the people in the US knew about the West India Regiments at the time of the War of 1812, in the years beforehand, how those notions about the West India Regiments actually impacted the war, and then how the West India Regiments themselves actually impacted the war. So firstly, how the idea of them impacted the war, and then how they actually militarily impacted the war. So we know that the US knew about the West India Regiments, and that's because they report on the Caribbean War quite regularly throughout the 1790s into the first decade of the 19th century. So, for example, and this is a newspaper clipping which I'm showing you, they report on the fact that the 1st West India Regiments won battle honours at Dominica and in Martinique in 1809 and in Guadeloupe in 1810. And here we have the Connecticut Journal from 1805 saying that these black troops have been engaged during the past and present war, and their behaviour has gained commendation, and it's owing to them in an eminent degree that the British flag now flies at Dominica. And during the conquest of Guadeloupe, a Boston publication reported that the black troops appear to have behaved most gallantly. So there's certainly their military prowess is well known in the US. However, they also know quite a bit about the dangers and the threats that local islanders feared about the West India Regiment. So, for example, the mutiny of the 8th West India Regiment in Dominica in 1802 is widely reported. The authoritative account, which comes from the Dominica Journal and then appears in newspapers in Barbados and St. Lucia and Antigua, is also then reprinted in its entirety in the New York Post on the 22nd of May 1802, and then subsequently copied and reprinted. And they talk quite a lot about the fact that the treatment of white officers by the mutineers was particularly violent, and they're quite sensationalized accounts, I guess, and they generally pay very little attention to the actual causes of the mutiny, amongst which were pay withheld, being made to work like slaves, clearing swampland, And instead they stressed, quote, the inexpressible fury of the black murderers. That was the big headline, I guess. That's the sort of the red top headline about the West India regiments. And what made this, of course, worse was that this was a trusted regiment, or the steadiest and most respectable corps, according to one report. And yet the men were prepared to murder all their officers, even as they were in bed. Now, the fact that British military commanders in the West Indies didn't actually blame the 8th West India Regiment very much, and they generally pointed the finger of blame at the governor of Dominica, Governor Johnston. That's not reported in the US at all. It is reported in British newspapers, but it's not reported in the US press at all. And if that wasn't bad enough, the US also reports on various fictional mutinies of the 8th West India Regiments, for example, in 1806 in Tobago, and in 1811 in Montego Bay. So here's a fictional report. And these are sort of confused and garbled accounts that are manufactured and reported on as, genuine revolts. And one thing, this actual report, which they says at one point the number of black mutineers and insurgents is estimated at 3,000. This is a common trope about how the US reports on the West India regiments in this early period. They consistently overstate the number of black soldiers that there are in the Caribbean. So here they're saying that there are about 3,000 black soldiers in Montego Bay, whereas actually there's not even 3,000 black soldiers in the entirety of the Jamaican command, which includes Jamaica and the Bahamas and Belize. And in fact, throughout the entire Caribbean, there's perhaps about 6,500 members of the West India regiments in this time period. And yet, here's another newspaper report that this is, I think, one of them. Yes, this is the one on the right is the Cooperstown Federalist. And this is on the eve of the War of 1812. Talks about that Britain has 25,000 black troops in the West Indies. And the one on the left, it's a bit more conservative. It says 10,000, but that's still overestimating the actual size of the West India regiments by about 50%. So, and it's now that we begin to understand, why these reports are quite so significant. It's not simply because of their numbers, exaggerated though they are, that the West India regiments were actually a threat. It's because they were formed into military regiments and, quote, inured to a strict military discipline. So these were not an informal militia, easily cowed, but rather they were battle-hardened troops who had spent the last decade confronting French regiments with significant success and venturing into the mountains of the Caribbean to hunt maroons. And since the British plan during the War of 1812 was widely understood to involve an invasion of the South in order to, quote, free and arm all the Negroes under their orders and officers to act against the whites, the faith that some slaveholders usually placed in the inability of enslaved people to organise themselves began rapidly to dissolve. Now, we first really see the West India regiments coming into play in the Chesapeake Campaign of 1813 and 14. So Admiral Cochrane, who is overall charge of the British flotilla, the British fleet in 1814, he issued a proclamation, and there's a copy here, this is from the National Archives, on the 2nd of April 1814, offering to all those who may be disposed to emigrate from the United States the choice of either joining British forces engaged in the current conflict or being sent with their families to settle in a British territory as free settlers. And he prints 1,000 copies of this proclamation, and they're given to raiding parties that touch on the shores of the Chesapeake to hand out, and it has an immediate effect, because enslaved Virginians flock to British lines. So if they encounter a British raiding party, then enslaved people come and join in, or they make their way on little boats out of British ships. And there's hundreds, and then very quickly thousands of these people. So by early May of 1814, so only about a month after this original proclamation, then the Rear Admiral George Cockburn reported that he dispatched more than 150 formerly enslaved people to Bermuda, and he'd kept 38 of the men to train as soldiers. And both training and recruiting was being done by some members of the 6th West India Regiment. Cockburn had no previous experience of black soldiers, but very quickly he professed himself pleased with these very fine fellows, whom he thought will neither show want of zeal or courage when employed by us in attacking their old masters. More importantly, the hope that Cochrane's proclamation would exacerbate the fears already prevalent amongst the white population appeared to be working. So Cockburn reported to his superiors that Virginians already know of your attentions respecting the blacks, and it has caused a most general and undisguised alarm. They expect Blackie will have no mercy on them, and they know he understands bushfighting and the locality of the woods as well as themselves. And they can perhaps play hide and seek in them even better. So by mid-June, Cockburn was employing his new black recruits in raiding parties and taking pleasure in how uncommonly and unexpectedly well the blacks behave in the several engagements. And particularly noteworthy, he thought, was the control exerted by their white officers, who entirely prevent their committing any improper outrages, he said. And so this organisation of these new colonial forces, they call the Colonial Marines, was modelled on the West India Regiments, with white officers leading them, and white officers and black NCOs from the 6th West India Regiment are involved in that process. And so both these black soldiers from the West India Regiments and the Colonial Marines are then involved in the March on Washington in the August of 1814. They're involved in the Battle of Bladensburg, and we have reports of their incurring some casualties. And then they're also present at the burning of Washington. And unless you look pretty carefully in War Office records, you would never know they're there, because any contemporary description or painting of what went on at Washington or at Bladensburg doesn't show a black face. There's no black soldiers shown, and yet there are plenty present, probably several hundred, in fact. By the end of this campaign, it was no secret that in the following year or in the following months that the next British target was going to be New Orleans. And what this forces some people in the US to do is to rethink whether they should raise their own bodies of black soldiers. So in November of 1814, the Washington Advertiser prints a letter from a gentleman living near Ohio to a member of Congress, and it lays out a plan to raise an army of blacks in order to combat a tardiness in filling our regiments. So it's meant to supplant, these missing soldiers. Slave owners would be expected to give up to a quarter of their enslaved men, and thereby save the rest perhaps from the grasp of the enemy. The state would give regular army pay to owners in compensation, while the recruits would receive clothing, provisions, and a quarter section of land at the expiration of service. And almost as an afterthought, the author confirms that military service would lead to emancipation from slavery. Mm. Unlike the West India Regiments, these black recruits would be led by white officers because, and this is a really important sentence, experience has proven that blacks thus organised make as good soldiers as European troops. Even more so because they are already possessed of the habit of subordination vital for a soldier. So this was a plan clearly influenced by how the British had organised the West India Regiments, and the successful British use of black soldiers in the Chesapeake Campaign of 1814 was forcing policy reconsiderations in the US. And this isn't the only time that this is proposed. There are 2 or 3 other similar proposals going on at the same time, though actually none of them actually come to full fruition before the end of the war. Now, since the British plan to target New Orleans was well known, then the US turned to how they thought it was going to be delivered. So a lot of speculation in the press as to how they thought the British would attempt to attack New Orleans. Now, the Baltimore Patriot claimed to have learned from an intelligent friend who has lately had excellent personal opportunities in the West India Islands, that no less than 7,000 black troops from Africa were due any day in Bermuda, clearly destined for an invasion of our southern states. This was completely unfounded speculation. And eventually the American press settled on a consensus that about 2 regiments of black troops were part of the British force that landed near New Orleans in December of 1814. The 1st West India Regiment and the 5th West India Regiments, which took part in this campaign, if they'd been at full strength, have amounted to about 2,000 men. And the US generally estimated their number at 1,200, and the actual army data suggests they're only slightly out with that. I reckon it's about 1,300 men. Most of these people had been soldiers for many years, and they were all battle hardened. They'd all been engaged in conflict with the French for a number of years. So the British commanders would have been confident that their experienced black soldiers would have been able to contribute fully to this campaign. But from the outset, the men of the 2 West India regiments really struggled to cope with really inhospitable conditions in Louisiana. So while all the talk beforehand had been how these black soldiers were uniquely equipped to cope in tropical environments, the reality in Louisiana in December of 1814 was far different. The initial troop landings took place in heavy rain, and the swamp where the men were encamped offered no decent shelter. And the next day, severe frost set in. William Surtees, the quartermaster of the Rifle Brigade, recalled that the 2 West India regiments in particular suffered in consequence of the severe cold, a thing which they were totally unacquainted with and against which they were ill provided, having nothing but their light and thin West India dress to keep it out. Some, he said, fell fast asleep and perished before morning. This, of course, is a clear failure of army planners to provide shelter and warm clothing. So frost, while it's rare in Louisiana, it's not unknown. And when ice that was 2 inches thick was reported, then any inadequately protected force would have suffered. Yet there's general agreement in both British and American commentary that the West India Regiment suffered more due to the cold because of an inherent racial weakness. And so the same ideology that affirmed the suitability of black bodies for tropical labour and hence slavery logically implied an inability to cope with cold. And it was the cold weather and attendant sickness, reported the Philadelphia Gazette, that had rendered almost all of the black troops unfit for duty. No mention was made of the impact that the weather might have had on white troops, since it was evidently understood by people that whites were used to cold and could cope perfectly well within it. So despite this very poor opening to the campaign for the West India regiments, they did take part in the Battle of New Orleans. And as we can see from this modern day reproduction, if you look carefully, the British forces are at the bottom of this plan, the American forces at the top, and you can see at the extremes, both the left and the right hand were West India regiments, one deployed in the swamps, the other by the banks of the Mississippi River. And yet, and here is a contemporary painting of the British assault. This is the Mississippi River right at the front of us. There's not a single black face amongst the British troops, and yet we know there were probably 1,300 of them involved in this battle. So here's a classic example of the erasure of black troops at the Battle of New Orleans. Now, following the defeat at New Orleans, obviously it's an American victory, and the British are forced to withdraw. Some British officers admitted to their American counterparts that the cold weather had knocked up their black troops, while one US commentator attributes their victory in part to the loss of their black troops, who, dying very fast owing to the frosts, had to be sent off. Now, implicit in these statements is the speculation that if the Battle of New Orleans had been fought in August, in the typical subtropical heat of Louisiana, the 2 full-strength West India regiments might have actually altered the outcome. So, with the British forced into an ignominious retreat at New Orleans, the Americans might, with some justifications, have felt that the war was over. And in fact, the peace treaty, although unbeknownst to any of the participants, had already been signed in Ghent in December. But there was one final coda to the war, and that also involved the West India regiments. So a week after the defeat at New Orleans, Admiral Cockburn landed on the Georgia coast. And he landed here on Cumberland Island. And his forces included around 200 members of the 2nd West India Regiment, which were brought in from the Bahamas, as well as a force of colonial marines from the Chesapeake. And they quickly captured not only all of Cumberland Island, but the town of St. Mary's. And the US press continued their by now long established overestimate of the number of black troops involved. The Charleston City Gazette had heard via a gentleman who left Savannah on Tuesday that 5,000 black troops were involved, which is probably 10 times the number of who were actually there. And these were, one newspaper said, the entire garrisons of Martinique, Guadeloupe, and the British West India Islands, which is nonsense. Yet, despite their modest numbers, the 2nd West India Regiment did play a full part in the military campaign. The majority of these soldiers in the 2nd West India Regiment had seen active service during the siege and capture of the city of Santo Domingo in 1809. And the regimental historian recorded that the column that attacked St. Mary's, the town of St. Mary's, was headed by the 2nd West India Regiment. John Miller, a private in the Royal Marines, wrote to his brother that the black regiment employed on this service acted with great gallantry. Blackie had no idea of giving quarters and was with difficulty restrained from putting the prisoners to death. The Yankee riflemen fired at our men in ambush, and Blackie, on the impulse of the moment, left the ranks and pursued them into the woods, fighting like heroes. A poor Yankee, disarmed, begged for mercy. Blackie replied, "He no come in bush for mercy," and he immediately shot him dead. Now, Miller's letter was amongst a bunch of captured British correspondence, and it was widely reprinted in the American newspapers as an example of this casual brutality of American troops. And while the plunder taken by the troops in St. Mary's included cotton and tobacco and provisions, weapons and property estimated to be worth about £100,000 sterling, the real aim of the expedition was to entice the large local enslaved population to join British forces. And hundreds of enslaved people took advantage of the offer, a bounty of $16 and a suit of British uniform. By the time Cockburn actually evacuated the island in March 1815, he'd removed more than 1,500 former slaves, men, women and children, from this area and to Bermuda. Now, the War of 1812 was ultimately a watershed in the history of the West India Regiments. Their miserable experience during the New Orleans campaign seems to have confirmed the unsuitability of service outside the Caribbean in the minds of military commanders. Admiral Cochrane reported to the Admiralty, "From what I have witnessed, the West India Regiments during the late expeditions can never be of use upon the continent of America except during the summer months." So shortly after 1815, the 5th, 6th, 7th and 8th West India Regiments were disbanded and resettled in Honduras, Trinidad and in Sierra Leone. Before 1815, the British Army had found their black soldiers to be invaluable. They'd proved themselves time and time again to be brave and reliable when pitted against the enemy. Army commanders had clearly harboured hopes that the West India Regiments might prove useful beyond the tropics. But after 1815, the West India Regiments would only serve in the Caribbean and in West Africa, where the astronomically high mortality rate amongst white regiments left the deployment of black soldiers as the only solution. The involvement of the West India Regiments in the War of 1812 not only determined their future deployment by the British Army, it also had a number of significant consequences for the United States. The mere existence of the West India Regiments gave Americans pause for thought, and it determined actual military strategy in one instance, with the state militias of Georgia and South Carolina unable to join the force defending New Orleans, lest their large enslaved populations fled en masse to the British. The well-reported military successes of black soldiers in the West Indies also forced Americans to contemplate new military strategies, such as the recruitment of their own black population. Moreover, the War of 1812 confirmed to many slaveholders that enslaved people in the US would seize any realistic and viable chance for freedom. They were simply waiting for an opportunity. They'd done so during the Revolutionary War in alliance with the British in 1812, and they would do so again during the Civil War in support of the Union. The fear that American slaves were fundamentally disloyal and would readily collaborate with an enemy never dissipated while slavery as an institution persisted. The retention of the West India Regiments as a garrison force in the Caribbean fueled that fear and suspicion in the antebellum South as late as the 1840s. During one period of tension in 1841, some in the US fretted that Britain had the capacity to dispatch an army of 200,000 blacks to invade the South. This significant and continuing overestimate of the strength of the West India Regiments by the US press can be seen as a symptom of that fear. And it's clear that the West India Regiments continued to be an excellent psychological weapon for the British long after the War of 1812 had ended. Thank you. I'll stop there.
That's great. Let me just unmute. Yes, that's really interesting. Start video. Excellent. That's really good. Really interesting. Lots of I think interesting questions. Oh, this is coming. Yes, lots of interesting questions. I think that arise. I mean, I have several, which I'll start off with. But those enslaved people who were sent off to Bermuda. I mean, there probably is not much record of those people, but they were sent off as enslaved people. They became free. What happened to those people? Do we know?
Yeah, they became free, and the British naval commanders were absolutely adamant, more so than their bosses in London, that anyone who came and took shelter on a British ship was made free. They're sort of extending the Somerset decision like exponentially, that just stepping foot on a British ship made you free. And American slaveholders periodically, under flags of truce, go and try and reclaim their enslaved property from the British ships, and the British commanders say, "You're welcome to come and ask." And they do. They go on board the ships and say, "Please come home." And universally, they all go, "No." Because they say to the Americans, "We're not making anybody leave." And they take them first to Bermuda. They don't really know what to do with them when they get to Bermuda, because there's a bit of Bermuda under naval control, which is where they end up. And I think it's called Ireland, as in the country of Ireland. And in the end, when the colonial Marines are disbanded along with these other regiments of the West India Regiments in 1816, they're sent to Trinidad.
Yeah.
And they settle in Trinidad, and they form a group which are called Americans.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So the British are absolutely adamant that they're not enslaved. Now the Americans are busy putting it about that what happens is that they are that the British are re-enslaving them in Jamaica and Barbados and places like that, and that appears in the US press, and the people like Cochrane and Coburn are incensed that this is an insult to their honour, that this is not happening, and they make a point whenever they can of saying, "We are not doing this. These are free people, and they are staying free." And basically, we don't care that you're complaining, so we're just going to,
There's a comment picking up about your point. There's a comment from Guy Granham in the chat about I think it was a pamphlet about the Americans, free black settlers in Trinidad, by sadly the late John Weiss. He used to come, in fact, occasionally to our seminars. I think there is a question about are there similar villages in other places of the formerly enslaved? I'm not sure there are, actually. I think the Americans were unique, but you may know better than that. You, Tim, may know better than that.
Oh, sorry. I think, well, somebody's commented in the chat that the descendants of these people were sort of absorbed into Trinidadian society, and they still live there. So
yeah. No, I think the question was. Sorry, Tim. I think the question was: were there other villages, other enslaved people or free people who were sent to other places in the Caribbean?
Yes, there were. There are certainly similar communities, but made up from the disbanded West India regiments in Belize, British Honduras as it was, and also in Sierra Leone. And there's quite large bodies of disbanded soldiers setting up new villages in Sierra Leone, and they're called sometimes after British military commanders. And so whether these actual places are still named that, I don't know. But at the time, certainly in the sort of 1820s, there are documents from Sierra Leone that count that these people are still living there. They've created their villages, and there are even some interviews with these former soldiers, and they tell you a bit about their life and what happened to them. Some of them have businesses because they're getting pensions from the army, so they have an income, which of course is not particularly typical for free blacks. The army's pay, it might not be a huge amount, but it's something. So they're getting a few pence a day as being disbanded soldiers.
Yeah. So Laura, whom I know as Roseanne Adderley, has a question for you.
Yes, good evening. I'm so glad to be here. Yeah, Laura is my legal name on the university Zoom, so it's my first name, and I've started, which is a terrible confusion to people who met me the first half of my career. Thanks for a wonderful presentation. I wonder, Tim, if you could say what your assessment is of the way they are assessing these Black soldiers. And I'll tell you what it calls to mind for me. When missionaries want money, they say, oh, the enslaved are eager to become Christians and I've got lots and lots of Africans. And if that doesn't work to get money, they say, you know, they're stubborn and I must work harder and therefore I need more money. So either assessment works. And I wondered after sort of everybody's got all this racial analysis, either Black people are scary or they're incompetent soldiers, you know, and I wondered sort of where you find kind of the level, as it were. Because it's sort of after 1815, it's clear, well, they certainly were done in by the weather, all right, that they didn't do well in North America. But it seems that in general, the disposition of these officers is to say, these troops are great, but is that sort of, you know, sort of self-serving, depending on what they want for continuing to recruit them or puffing up their own careers or their success, or I'm wondering what's really going on here other than, there's very set moments of racial fear, but what the quote unquote true assessment is of how, you know, how the forces are performing.
Yeah, the British military commanders in the Caribbean are usually, especially during the war, so up through 1815, you know, in the Caribbean, are usually full of praise for their Black soldiers, that they think they are hardy, brave, you know, obedient, which is, you know, these are all things you want in a soldier. You want them to do what they're told and to do, you know, and they say that the things that they sometimes don't do quite so well, like, you know, the formal drilling and this, that, doesn't really matter, because most of the time the warfare in the Caribbean isn't like that. It's go off into the mountains and find people and you know and ambushes and the sort of light infantry type thing. They're full of praise for their physical skills, and especially things like their tracking skills, their accuracy in firing, those kind of things that they're full. I mean, they love these Black soldiers, and these reports are generally really, really, really positive. It takes a while for that to change, and it changes, you know, by the middle of the century, and then they're much more stereotypical. You know, they're not as good. You know, I'd much rather have a white man, and you know, they aren't all they're cracked up to be. But in this early period, you know, when they're actually using them in military conflicts, they're really full of praise.
Yeah, I have other questions, but you've got other hands up.
Okay.
I apologize if I run off. I've got a student coming.
Okay. All right. Allison, would you like to ask your question?
Thank you so much. So one of the things that I'm interested in is what happened to these folks once they've left, or they've been brought to these other spaces, right? What I know about the Americans in Trinidad is, of course, they come as free people and they're settled in these areas that are really very isolated. Apart from, you know, the weirdness of Trinidad, that you still have enslavement when they're settled there. And there's this whole kind of Spanish-French culture because the British have basically just taken over Trinidad. So I'm interested in, I guess, some of these other places that you talked about, Tim, in Honduras and in Sierra Leone, and I guess in Bermuda, I'm assuming too, where these folks were allowed to settle by the British, and how they interacted or not, or didn't interact with the enslaved Blacks that were there.
Yeah, generally, I think they are sort of kept apart. I think one of the reasons Trinidad is chosen is because Trinidad is, the British would see it as empty. You know, it's not Jamaica and it's not Barbados. It's a new British possession. While there are slaves in Trinidad, there are big areas of Trinidad that are, you know, depopulated or unpopulated comparatively, where they can be settled without basically interfering with the plantation slave society. The same is probably true of Belize, because you know, Belize is mainly swamp, and it's not a big plantation society like you would get in Jamaica or in, you know, or even parts of Guyana or whatever. So again, you can put people, you know, inland and almost forget about them. Sierra Leone is the one we probably know more about, because the Sierra Leone company keeps better records, even though they're not complete or anything like that. But it actually bothers to go out and talk to these people and count them and do a little assessments of them. So the interesting thing there is how they interact with the other groups in Sierra Leonean society, because there are, of course, people native to Sierra Leone. Then it's where all the liberated Africans are dumped, you know, to use a horrible phrase, but you know, when the British are kicking them off other people's ships, they're just leaving them in Sierra Leone. And so there's like this tripartite society. A better historian of Sierra Leone than me will be able to account for that sort of tension, but there is certainly a lot of tension between those groups. I think, you know, people native to that part of West Africa, people left there by the British, and then these former imperial agents, I guess, being left there.
So I think that if anybody's from Belize on this call, or who's been to Belize, would have to argue about your description of Belize as a swamp. It's much more interesting than that. But let's move on to there's a question in the chat from Ian, who says, does the evidence indicate that West India Regiment troops routinely serve for longer periods than troops in British regiments?
Yes. And there's two reasons for that. One, when the West India regiments when people signed up, they were signed up for life. So they weren't signed up for a set period. Now, in reality, they weren't kept for life. They were retired when the army felt that they were no longer that useful. And they were retired to these places again, you know, Trinidad and wherever. But plenty of them served for 20 and 30 years. White regiments, I think the standard was 20 years, but a lot of them don't live that long. So, especially in the Caribbean. So white troops definitely don't serve as long as black troops. And I'm just going back to Belize. My opinion of Belize is shaped by all the reports that I read of people who actually went to Belize and said it's nothing but a swamp. And so I claim no first-hand knowledge of Belize, so I'm really sorry about that.
Well, those of us who've been to Belize and have connections to Belize, as one of our organizers does, would have to disagree. Now, Rhonda says that talking about the Americans in Trinidad, I don't think they were absorbed into Trinidad society because, of course, they came as free people. And then there's a longer comment, Rhonda's longer comment, which you can also see. And there's a question from Zachary, who has his hand raised.
Hi all, thank you, Tim, for this great presentation. Thank you, Kate, Gad, for organizing. Look, I come here as an archaeologist that has studied British forts in Dominica, including the Cabrits, where the 1802 revolt took place, and now here in Jamaica, where I work at sites around Kingston Harbor, including Fort Augusta. Tim, I just want to say thank you. I really do appreciate the issue of erasure because it's so very relevant to how we imagine armies in the past, even all the way up into the present. So I appreciate that point. And as a historical archaeologist, this information is not absent. You can read against the grain in the archive. You can go through the archives of soil as archaeologists do. I'm interested to know about, compared to what I know in the Caribbean, how material spatial realities of Black British troops in the US, if you've heard anything about that, garrison strategies during these campaigns, degrees of segregation, whether it's marked in space between where white soldiers, Black soldiers are living, or perhaps even the materials used for encampments. These are some distinctions I've seen in my own research, and I'm wondering, with all your experience and if you've come across anything like that. So thank you again all for the opportunity.
Thank you. I guess, campaigning camps, for example, the one that would almost certainly have been, constructed in New Orleans, they are very ephemeral structures, aren't they? They are, you know, they're deliberately designed to be movable. So there may be, it's difficult to know how people were housed and garrisoned on those kind of campaigns. We know a lot more about how they were garrisoned in the Caribbean, and they're nearly always garrisoned separately to white troops. And a lot of that is to do with ideas about health and race. And so, you know, Jamaica's a good example. So, you know, white troops are widely seen to be, you know, it's impossible for them to live at Fort Augusta. Fort Augusta's in the harbour, and it's like a death sentence. That's how they describe it. It's a death sentence for white troops to go and live there. And that's why they build up Park Camp, and that's why they eventually move the white troops to Newcastle, which is like 4,000 feet up. And they do that because it's healthy for white troops. Whereas, you know, they think that the coastal forts are particularly healthy for black troops, and it's not like they think, you know, they're unhealthy, therefore we'll consign the black troops to that. They actually say, no, the coastal areas are the healthiest places for black troops, and so we're doing them a favour by putting them in these coastal forts. And
Newcastle can get cold, that's for sure.
Yeah,
so.
and that's why.
Cool,
and that's why
not cold.
And that's why they choose it, because that's but they equally, they wouldn't dare put black soldiers at Newcastle, because they would get sick based on the ideas that come out of things like the New Orleans campaign. The only time I've ever seen white and black soldiers garrisoned together in the same buildings is in Gibraltar, when the 4th West India Regiment spends 2 years there, 1817 to 1819, and they're in the casemates barracks, which, you know, if you ever go to Gibraltar, that's the place where you sit and have a nice drink in the afternoon. Is that you know, surrounded by you know, cafes now, but that had a mixed garrison, and we know they lived in the same buildings. So that's the only place I found that happened. But usually in the Caribbean, white troops and black troops are segregated. And usually the white troops got better accommodation than black troops. Not always, but mainly they did.
I think Zachary described the very interesting barracks in Newcastle as cold. Would be far-fetched given the winter we've just had. Now but you don't have to face that. Anyway, it's a very interesting chat about reading recommendations, and Laura Adderley, whom I guess I now have to call Laura. I'm astonished by this, but anyway, there we are. All my life I've called you something else.
My friends still do that. Hi, I see. Yeah, so yeah, strangers call me Laura.
You what? Sorry.
I said strangers call me Laura, so please do continue calling me Roseanne.
Oh, okay.
I'm quite officious.
Okay.
I was wondering,
sorry.
Are there other people in the queue?
Go ahead, please ask a question.
No, Tim, Zachary, I wondered.
Well, hang on, Laura, Roseanne. Zachary, did you finish? Did you want to ask something else? No, fine. Roseanne, please.
I wondered if this is more from my local knowledge living in New Orleans. Is there any comment in the British, on the British side of this? Because I've always wondered about this, about the free black soldiers fighting for the US in the battle at New Orleans, because the city now takes great pride in them. They're not very numerous. And it's sort of, and Jackson, for all of his failings, and there are many, part of the reason some historians assert that they were successful is that he was willing, he said, look, we're going to have to, recruit and get organized anyone willing and capable. Otherwise, this British invasion is going to succeed. And I wonder if the British have a comment on them, because I know nothing, of the actual battle, like what, and in some ways it gets to Zachary's question and your comment that the sources aren't particularly good on the ground during battle. But I wonder if they comment on them at all.
Not that I've seen.
Okay.
And they rarely comment on their own black troops, from the British side. So, I mean, there are some, but not as often as you'd think. And usually, especially because it's a bit of a disaster, they usually say they weren't as good as we thought they were going to be. So, because, you've sent them into, a sub-zero environment wearing a flimsy little thing. So, They were cold, not surprised. I'd be cold. No, they don't particularly mention it. And, you know, even when the Americans during the Revolutionary War have French black soldiers from Saint-Domingue fighting on their behalf, the British don't tend to mention it. But equally, the Americans never mention the fact that there were way more black combatants on the British side than there were on the American side. So I remember giving a paper in Savannah about the siege of Savannah in 1779, and pointing out that there's loads of local enslaved people fighting on the British side, and local people didn't know that. They knew all about the French blacks from New Orleans fighting on their side, from Haiti, but they didn't know anything about black people fighting on the British side, of which there were thousands. So.
No, I was going to say here, I've said this to people in New Orleans context, and it's like, are you sure of this? And I said, yes, I'm sure. It's factual that there were black soldiers among the British troops. And I would say, I do not know this, and it's not my area. I think that the uplifting of the free black soldiers in the War of 1812 is a public history, reshaping of public memory project of the relatively recent past.
Yeah.
Within the community of free people of color here, they were very proud of their service in the 19th century. But I think broader uplifting of their role within the war.
It's also at least partly, I think, an attempt by some Americans at the time to say that the black people were on their side, when the facts of thousands of black Americans fleeing to British ships tells a completely different story. That's not the one they want to tell. So, you know, if they could say, oh no, they were all supportive of us and weren't we great? You know, and then look at what Jackson does. You know, Jackson's future career, which is just appalling.
And that's exactly the biggest story. The bigger black story of the War of 1812 is the number of African Americans who turned to the British. That is far and away a bigger story.
Oh yeah.
Still a hard sell in academic and popular discourse in this country.
Yeah, and it's just erased. It's just ignored. The fact that there's probably 3,000 to 4,000 from between Virginia and then Georgia who run away, and that's not counting the ones who ended up at that fort in Apalachicola in Florida the year after in 1816. I mean, there's been several books written on that recently, and that was again all done by the British, and that's in a way a coda of a coda of a coda, but there are no West India regiments involved in that, but that's, you know, yet another sort of example of, you know, black rebelliousness in this era when everything's incredibly fluid. The Americans' control over the South is really weak, and Native American groups are still really significant. The Creek, the Seminoles, they're all, you know, vying for power, and it's really not very clear that the Americans are going to come out being so dominant by like say 1830 that they end up.
I think Isaac has raised his hand. If you unmute yourself.
Hi guys, thank you for that talk, Tim. That was fascinating. I just wanted to ask, circling back to something you said about kind of the skills and the capabilities of the West India regiments. You were mentioning that they are really good at tracking and ambush, counter ambush, all these kind of things. To what extent do you think those skills were kind of a result of experiences of warfare in Africa?
I think it's quite likely. We know that, Manuel Barcia's book on African warfare being translated into the Americas, is the go-to one here. And a lot of the people who were captured into slavery and then sold on slave ships, as a lot of the young men are captured in war. And so it's quite likely they have these kind of skills anyway. And in 1797 through to 1807, in that 10 years, the army is buying people straight from the slave ships in order to put them in the West India regiments. And again, not widely known apart from by historians, the army owns more slaves in the Caribbean than any slaveholder, does. And that's, again, we don't realize that, but they do. But with, some really important caveats in that they own them as slaves because they buy them from slave ships, but then they treat them exactly the same as every other soldier. So they're not differentiated by the fact that they have been bought. They are given the same weaponry, the same accoutrement. They are sent off to fight. They are given the same barracks, the same foods, and then they are disbanded when they're no longer useful. They never try and sell them. So once they're sick of them or they don't need them anymore, they don't say, well, I can now recruit my investment. And they spend, well, in modern day money, multi-millions on buying these people. Buckley's book does give us a figure, and I can't remember it now, but it's in the thousands, how many they buy. It's in the thousands. And I think the fact that they come pre-skilled in warfare techniques, a significant number of them, is probably really crucial, more crucial than we'll ever really know, because one thing we lack with the West India regiments for a long period of time is first-hand testimony by them.
Yeah.
So, and I should also add a caveat, although we tend to think of them as being Africans, and they are, a lot of them are Africans. In the earliest years, there's a significant Caribbean population, which come from captured French islands. So a lot of them are from Guadeloupe and Martinique. And there's a reasonable number are taken by the British from Saint-Domingue, when the British evacuate Saint-Domingue in 1798. Then they're enlisted into the West India regiments. So it's a much more heterogeneous body in this first 10 years than it becomes, say, from about 1805, 6, 7 through till the 1840s. It is really very heavily African. But in that earliest year, it's a little bit more, polyglot, I guess.
Presumably, there can be no information about the integration of formerly British West India Regiment soldiers freed, go into the communities as free people, but and then merge presumably with the free Black community.
No, I mean, we have very little information about that, and by say the 1830s and 40s, the policy of resettlement in specific spaces, whether it be Belize or Trinidad, wherever, has sort of broken down, because these men now often have families in the Bahamas or St. Lucia, wherever, and they don't want to leave and they want to stay where they are. So, and they often do get, they just move into the community and they become regular folk, I guess. So and that's a part of a wider transition to being the entire regiment is much more Caribbean by say the 1840s and 1850s than it was before, and it's generally Caribbean born men.
Good. Steve has a question.
One thing that you haven't really mentioned was that given the appalling treatment of the European soldiers, I mean, I've been reading this about the
I didn't see what that was.
Oh, sorry, it's Linda Coley's book on the lash and imperial slavery and imperial soldiery, and it's I mean, flogging seems to have been pretty endemic in the British Army, and how does that fit in with all this, really? I mean, as I say, it's just as I say, the treatment of the white troops was appalling. So were the Black troops treated equally badly, worse or better, or what?
Yeah, they certainly weren't treated better. I did some statistical analysis of this, and they are in general treated a little bit worse. So they are more likely to be beaten, and they are more likely to get more lashes. And you can also do an analysis of how many lashes they are sentenced to and how many they actually get, because at some point a surgeon is meant to intervene and say enough's enough. And they intervened more earlier for white people than they did for Black people. And that's because the narrative of the time, and it's written down in some of these surgeons' records, is that Black skin is thicker than white skin. Therefore, it can take more punishment than white skin. And that fits into a whole narrative of, Black people don't feel pain and all this kind of stuff, which is really common in the medical literature of the time. So it's part of that environment that they're just buying into. And so we know that they are, beaten, more regularly than white soldiers are. But there's no real evidence that they commit more offences. White people certainly had up on charges of drunkenness, all the time, much more so than the Black soldiers. But the Black soldiers quite commonly sell bits of their kit, so they get charged with, not having any trousers or missing boots or something because they flogged it, and some guy has come along and bought it, and then they've I don't know what they do with the money, but they and then they get up on that charge. So
Guy has asked a question: where are these surgeons' reports?
I would advise you to look at my book, because I discuss a lot of this stuff about the ideas about racialized bodies. There you go. There's Rosie's put in my book title there. You can go and buy it, or get your library to buy it, because it's really expensive. And there are some surgeons' reports in the National Archives. Some. There would have been, every regiment had a surgeon, and every regiment's surgeon would have provided an annual report back to the Army Medical Department in London. Only a small fraction of those exist, but some of the data was collected and printed in statistical form. So we do know a reasonable amount about it. But these ideas about black skin appear in lots of standard medical journals as well. So you get, and a lot of the medical journals and a lot of this writing about black bodies are written by people who were surgeons in the Caribbean. So it's amazing how many of these people who write about tropical diseases or about army life and everything like that, when you look at their careers, they spent 5 years in Jamaica or in a garrison hospital in Barbados, and some of them were actually attached to the West India Regiments at some point, or went on campaign with them. So that's really frequent, and that's therefore they have first-hand knowledge of these men, which is great. It was great for me when I was writing my book. So.
Okay, Alison, did you want to ask another question, or was your hand raised from before?
No, I want to touch on something that Tim talked about just now.
Please do.
In terms of the integration, because again, this is my area that continues to fascinate me, because one of the things that intrigues me here is this idea that you have these free people who are coming and settling. And Tim, you talked about them, kind of, I guess, marrying with the local population. But of course, given that many of these folks who were there, who were also Black, would have been enslaved. And of course, the status of the child would follow the mother. And then these Americans, definitely in Trinidad, are of a different religious and cultural background from many of the Trinidadians there. I mean, this place that they're settled in is seriously isolated from the rest of the island. I mean, seriously, seriously isolated. I would say even today.
Alison, where is it in Trinidad? Where?
It's in the southern part of, it's mostly in the southern part. And as someone who grew up in Trinidad, I may have went there once or twice in my life. So it's interesting to me. So I'm wondering, in terms of what you were hinting at, this integration, just how much really takes place prior to the ending of slavery, right? Because remember, even after slavery ends, there are all these laws that are passed that say that the formerly enslaved Africans have severe restrictions even on their ability to purchase land on the island, right? Whereas the Americans have land. Okay, so that's why I'm saying that I think there are distinctions, and these distinctions are even present today. People who take absolute pride in knowing that they are descendants of Americans versus people like me who just don't know who the hell came off the boat when.
Yeah. I mean, I think that it's a subject that would be great to research more if the data was there and if the information was there. We know that the men of the regiments had wives, and these wives, one has to think, came from the local population. And we know that because in the annual returns of the regiments, they list women and children, sort of hangers-on effectively. And some of the reports, the annual reports, talk about women doing, the cooking for their men, doing the cleaning for their men.
Sorry to interrupt you. Didn't some of them get on the ships with their families? Because that's the reports that I have from South Carolina. That
oh yeah, yeah, they did. I was more talking about the men in the West India regiments. These, I mean, again, the colonial Marines who become the Americans are. I was distinguishing them and the West India Regiment soldiers, who we know had, some of them had local wives. So the Americans, they came as family groups, I guess, didn't they? Just like the Carolina Corps in the Revolutionary War, we know they end up settling in, I think, St. Lucia, and then they spend some time in Grenada. But there are men and women and children attached to that corps as well, all coming from South Carolina in the 1780s. And so we know a little bit about family life, but not very much. We know a little bit about statistics, but not enough even to write an article, I guess.
I think Kate has a question.
I don't know if I'm butting in before Zachary, if that's a new hand or an old hand. Okay. I just wanted to ask about the 1802 Mutiny in Dominica, and, you know, given the timing of it, and, you know, you've mentioned that some of the members of the regiment had been recruited into the regiment having come from Saint-Domingue when the British evacuated. I wondered, are there any, sorry if this is a basic question, but are there any connections between events in Saint-Domingue and the mutiny in 1802 in Dominica in terms of...
I don't think so. I don't think so, because there are very specific causes of the mutiny in 1802, and the person we blame, with complete justification, is the governor, who's you know, an imperial shyster of like the highest level. And how that this guy didn't end up in prison, well, I don't know, because he scammed his way to the highest office and should have been, you know, done. And even his brother at one point denounces him as a scoundrel. So, you know, he reminds me of certain politicians today. I'm not going to name any, but he. There's very specific causes about how these men are being used in Dominica, and it's not, doesn't seem to be a general spirit of rebelliousness about you know, black life, whatever. And it's only ever, I'm trying to think, no more than about a fifth of the men are involved. So it's not all of them. But it's a really interesting episode. And I mean, I was really interested to hear that Zachary was doing some archaeological work there, because there's so many things we don't know about that mutiny that archaeology could find, that could be the answer. And I remember speaking to, what's the guy's name? The guy, you know, the famous guy who talks.
Talking Lennox Honeychurch?
Yes, I remember talking to him, and he was talking to me about, you know, some of the archaeological possibilities. So I mean, I'm hoping that you're doing some of those. So we don't, for example, know where all the men were buried who were shot. I mean, there was hundreds of them. Well, more than 100 were killed as a result of the mutiny, and again, disappeared, these guys. So almost certainly buried somewhere on that fort. But where, we don't know. And again, right for archaeology, and there's so many great sources written about it. There's so many first-hand accounts of it. There's so many inquests and post-mutiny inquiries. And then, I mean, you know, Johnston is even, you know, court-martialed, and there's like a 700-page court-martial document about him, which he gets off. It's like, how he gets off is a mystery to me.
He was a governor. He was a governor. Zachary, is your hand raised for?
Yeah, Dad, thank you so much. Again, it's been a kind of isolating, depressing week or so of marking exams here. So this is just a great opportunity, especially to talk about an exciting topic like this. And just, Tim, I think Buckley talks about 13,000 to 14,000 purchased straight from West Africa, 700,000 pounds or something like that. But this question, and many people, Gad, Allison, and others have talked about, integration, interaction once Black soldiers are free and entering communities. One of the things, and Tim, I'll be honest with the archaeology, it was very focused on the laborer village, which is very rare within fort life to have that clearly marked off on a series of maps. So that was good for archaeology, and comparing that to the material realities in the outer Cabrit soldiers barracks, where a number of the men involved in 1802 likely came down, and that's a hike and a half, but it's something. But one of the most remarkable assemblages from that work, the housing patterns, and I mentioned a question comparing housing materials, but within the household of what is marked as pioneer laborer hut is an assemblage of low-fired coarse earthenware. So this is like the pots that Creole foodways emerged from within this laborer hut, along with a 6th West India Regiment baldric buckle that they likely served in Dominica. Again, it's after the revolt, but shows this level of interaction likely, whether it's enslaved soldier going down there, interacting within this village compound, or British Army strategy of relocating soldiers. They move West India Regiment individuals in there, but you're dealing with, layers of ethnically similar but socially distinct populations that are integrating within the walls of colonial forts, So, and I'm from there. My question, and I'm again distracted. The question would be, did you see in your research, and I know it's quite limited, whether it was fears of interaction between armed formal Black soldiers and local enslaved populations, or actual realities of, hey, we lost a handful of Black soldiers today. They went off into the swamp. They went off, and they're rumored to be on this estate. have you ever come across those types of instances in the archival record? There's material evidence archaeologically, but I wonder from archives whether it's fear or reality being expressed about that point. Thank you.
I think the fear is is much, much larger than the reality of it. I mean, Rosie wrote, a great PhD on this. So this fear of Black soldiers combining with the local enslaved population is expressed very forcefully by lots of West Indian planters. At the time when the West Regiments were formed in 1795, right through till, well, you're still reading that and 30, 40 years later. The reality is the opposite, I would say. We know that the West India Regiment, the first West India Regiment, was absolutely crucial in suppressing the slave revolt in Barbados in 1816. They were absolutely crucial to suppressing the revolt in Demerara in 1823. So, and then they are heavily involved with the suppression of the Moran Bay Rebellion in 1865. So they identify with their officers and the wider idea of being an army soldier, much more so than they do with the enslaved population. And why they're so outraged in Dominica in 1802 is because the governor is treating them like slaves. It's like, we are not slaves. We are the king's men. We have that pride. We have the red coat. Don't you dare treat us like slaves. And if you do, this is going to be the consequence. And they're quite happy to have informal interactions with enslaved people. In Dominica in 1802, we know that local people in there's a little settlement called Portsmouth just next to the fort, and we know that this is where some people are meeting and they're common conversations, and that these enslaved people are the ones saying they're treating you like slaves. You know what they're going to do? They're going to make you slaves next. And they're sort of like stirring the pot, and it's the local slaves who are stirring the pot. And that's what, one of the things that kickstarts this thing. So, and it's a great story, I think, but I see very little interaction. I mean, when people go AWOL, which of course soldiers do all the time, they nearly always come back. And usually going AWOL meant that they just didn't come back in time, so, and then they get beaten, and that's where you read the records. But not many. You read desertion records, but they're not they're not that common.
Great. I think we have stretched Tim, not as far as he can go. He can go a lot further. I know this personally. There's a lot of very, very interesting stuff in the chat. If people are interested in looking at it, it's great to have had this conversation. Zachary in particular, from an historical archaeological point of view, particularly interesting, and from everybody else in Trinidad. Zoom has its advantages, as we can see from the questions, where people are from, and the chat. I want to thank Tim for a great presentation. You can see that by the nature of the questions. I will just mention, before thanking him finally, or again, that we will meet again in 2 weeks, quite soon, on the 2nd of June, when we have Eve Hayes de Calaf, different topic, but still fascinating, legal identity, race, and belonging in the Dominican Republic. But it remains for me to thank Tim very much. I'll be in touch with you anyway, as we normally are. You'll see all the interesting chat and discussion, and thanks to you for all of this. And